Hello, AP Environmental, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Environmental Systems. So, this will be a very quick story, so gather around the pond, my little tadpoles, as we venture into environmental systems. Another important property of water is its ability to dissolve hydrogen or hydroxide containing compounds known as acids and bases. So an acid is a substance that contributes H plus hydrogen ions to a solution, and a base is a substance that contributes hydroxide ions or OH minus ions to a solution. And both acids and bases typically dissolve in water. And when an acid dissolves in water, it disassociates into its positively charged H plus ions and its negatively charged ions. And two important acids that we'll discuss in the future are nitric acid, which is HNO3, and sulfuric acid, which is H2SO4. This is because these guys are primary components of acid rain, and we'll talk a lot more about acid rain during pollution. All right, bases, on the other hand, they disassociate into negatively charged hydroxide ions, these OH minus ions, and these negatively charged ions are part of components like calcium hydroxide, which can be used to neutralize acids and emissions from power plants. But the pH indicates the relative strength of an acid or a base, basically how many H pluses or OH minuses it's producing. A pH value of 7 is often pure water, and that is like completely neutral, meaning that the number of hydrogen ions and the number of hydroxide ions are completely equal. Anything above 7 is what we call basic or alkaline, and anything below 7 is considered acidic. So the lower the number, the stronger the acid, and the higher the number, the more basic the actual substance. And the pH scale is also logarithmic, meaning that each number on the scale changes by a factor of 10. So how this logarithmic scale works, for example, is if I have a substance with a pH of 5, it has 10 times the hydrogen ion concentration of a substance with a pH of 6, and it's 10 times more acidic. So water in equilibrium on Earth's atmosphere is typically at about 5.65, and that's because the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere dissolves, basically making Earth a weak acid. And we see this happen in a couple of different systems, but pretty much most environmental systems will range in the acidic category. So environmental systems contain both chemical and what we call biological reactions. All right, a chemical reaction occurs when atoms separate and they form molecules, and then they rearrange or recombine themselves to form other molecules. And in a chemical reaction, no atom is ever destroyed, nor is it created. And although the bonds between particular atoms may change, like for example, like methane, which is CH4, when it's burned in air, it reacts with 2 molecules of oxygen, O2, and it creates carbon dioxide. And of course 2 molecules of water. It's what we call a combustion reaction. And so although that these things change, their molecules, the actual carbon, hydrogens, and oxygens that are originally there, they're still the same. So a chemical reaction can occur in either direction. You can have a combustion of fossil fuels from nitrogen gas that combines with oxygen gas to form atmospheric molecules, which is nitrogen oxide, NO. So respectively, they would look like, all right, like that. There we go. N2 plus O2 equals 2 molecules of NO. And in the reverse, the reaction can also proceed in the opposite direction, where NO could break up into atmospheric nitrogen and atmospheric oxygen. And so the observation that no atom's created nor is it destroyed in a chemical reaction leads us to what we call the law of conservation of matter, which states that matter cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be changed in its own form. And these chemical principles are important to environmental scientists because the law of conservation of matter explains why we cannot easily dispose of hazardous materials. If something is hazardous, then it typically will remain hazardous even if we try to convert it through something like combustion. Here's an example. So when we burn material that combusts heavy metals like automotive batteries, the atoms of that metal inside of that battery, they don't disappear. They turn themselves elsewhere in the environment, where they can actually end up being more harmful for humans and other organisms. So for this reason, understanding the law of conservation of matter is crucial to any environmental scientist. Now, in the environment, chemical and biological reactions happen simultaneously, in most systems anyway. We've seen how chemical compounds form and then how they respond to various processes like burning or freezing. We've talked about those. So to understand this biological process, we must first look at the distinction between compounds that we call inorganic and those compounds that we call organic. So inorganic compounds are compounds that either do not contain the element carbon or contain carbon that is bonded to something else, usually other than hydrogen. So for example, like ammonia, NH3, sodium chloride, NaCl, water, H2O, and carbon dioxide. All right, organic compounds are compounds that have a carbon to carbon or a carbon to hydrogen bond, like C6H12O6, glucose, or fossil fuels, or natural gas, methane gas, CH4. Organic compounds are the basis of all biological molecules, and they're important to life, because they're things like carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids that make up your DNA, and lipids. And because of these four types of what we call macromolecules, they're relatively large molecules too. They are also known as what we call macromolecules. So the four major macromolecules are carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and then, of course, lipids. So carbohydrates are compounds composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. We like to think of them as glucose. And sugars can link together and form these long, very complex chains of carbohydrates and polysaccharides, like many sugars linked together. Plants store all of these compounds as a starch, which is made up of long chains of these covalently bonded glucose molecules. And the starch could also be used by animals when they eat plants. Cellulose is a component of plant leaves, and stems is another polysaccharide that consists of these long chains. So basically the entire plant is really made up of carbohydrates. And cellulose is the raw material for cellulose ethanol, which is a type of fuel that potentially one day might replace gasoline, which is made by plants. Ethanol. If you've heard of those cars that runs on ethanol, All right, so moving on. Proteins. So proteins are like a very critical component of all living organisms, and they are these long nitrogen-containing organic molecules, and we call those amino acids. And proteins play an important role as far as like structure, support, function. They're also energy storage and internal transport, and they basically defend off foreign things too. Enzymes are a special type of protein that help control the rates of all chemical reactions inside of our body. Antibodies are also something that comes to mind, and they basically protect us from infection, and they're a certain type of enzyme which is made up of proteins. Nucleic acids, our third macromolecule here, is an organic compound which is in every living cell. And these are long chains of DNA or RNA. If you remember, DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, is the genetic material that organisms pass along to their offspring, and it contains like a code for reproducing components to the next generation. And hopefully you remember learning about that in biology, along with RNA, which is the ribonucleic acid. And that basically is the translation of stored DNA, which makes making proteins actually possible through protein synthesis. And finally here we have lipids. And lipids are these small biological molecules that do not mix with water. A couple of them are fats, waxes, and steroids. Those are all lipids. And lipids form like a major part of the membranes and the surrounding part of our cells. So I know you remember the day where we told you that the smallest structure and functional component of an organism is known as a cell. A cell is a highly organized living entity that consists of those four types of macromolecules and some watery solution which is surrounded by this lipid portion membrane. And some organisms, like most bacteria and algae, they're only like one cell. This cell contains all the structures and functions and organelles that the cell needs to like live and reproduce. And larger organisms that are more complex, like the brine shrimp that we talked about earlier, those are like multicellular. And we'll learn about a variety of those, as time goes on here. So I know you remember doing a cell project and you had to list somewhere probably 10 to 12 organelles, mitochondria and the nucleus and the nucleolus and stuff. But would you believe me if I told you that there were hundreds of types of organelles, most of which your biology teachers don't even know and understand how they work. So where we teach young children somewhere between 5 and 15 types of organelles, realize now that we know that within each tiny, tiny cell that we can barely see under a microscope, the factory has a lot of doors, a lot of rooms, a lot of windows that we just really didn't understand up here until recently.
I know who PD9 really looks like.
What is that? PD9. So these are some of my most favorite cells. If you look in the top left-hand side, that's the largest cell that I know of. It's almost as big as that guy's hand. That is a single-cell algae. It lives in the ocean and coral reefs. And what you are looking at is one cell. And inside of that, it has a lot of cytoplasm inside of it. Inside of that cell contains all of its organelles. What's really fascinating about this type of cell is that its membrane is a little thicker than normal, and it still functions just like an operating little factory. Moving on to the right here, this is Volvox, and he is a photosynthetic type of what we call chlorophyte, and that's the green algae that just kind of floats around. And not only is this guy like a single cell, but he lives in like almost this colony of cells trapped within another membrane. It's really cool because, I mean, all right, so they're plants, but they like to grow and hang out in like a colony inside another membrane. I don't know. It's just, life is fascinating. It finds a way. All right, so technically there's really no such thing as like a single cell animal, but there are a lot of what we think are like animal creatures. If you remember the Protista kingdom back in the day, things like paramecium and amoeba, and that's the guy you're looking at right here. So it's technically works like an animal, where they hunt and they move, and they are only like one cell big. They're very predatory, and a lot of these are also responsible for a lot of disease too. They have these little flagellum or little tails, and they can cause all kinds of things. Like if you know what the red tide is, that's just one type of protist basically wreaking havoc on things. And so a lot of them, because they depend on other organisms, they're parasitic in nature, they don't always have the best reputation. You can have heard of the amoebas, like the amoebas that are out there causing disease and killing people. But anyway, these guys basically have like animal-like traits, but they are a single cell. These right here, these are called rotifers. These are pond water's best kept secrets. They're also known as the wheeled animals, because if you see these little tiny mouth parts right here, they actually rotate like in a circle like that. They rotate really, really fast, and under a microscope they look like teeth. And we have a ton of them out there. I mean, as you're walking through the wetlands, you can like continue to bump into them. But anyway, they're very cool, and they're not all actually like single cell, but they're extremely few cells that make up these creatures, because they're basically surrounded by this one cell membrane, and they have a couple working components inside of their bodies. Rotifers, that's what they are.